That's why I don't understand this Putin cult and its attack on the Western ideal of freedom of speech. And that was one of the main things you addressed in your article very eloquently, was the hypocrisy of demanding free speech here while sponsoring the suppression of free speech in Russia.
Exactly. The Putin cult has essentially taken over the entire alternative media. That's basically why I don't like to be involved in it so much anymore, because there's just numerous factions and bandwagons that you have to jump on board in order to be accepted, in order to get the interviews and so forth. And since I was going against the grain on that for years, probably since like 2014, I had written numerous articles, saying Putin is not a saint. Here's all these problems with him, and I would get so much like backlash with that, just like you're getting. I'm sure you probably get all kinds of stuff saying you're an agent, you work for the CIA, you're a Zionist, right? Like,
Right. In general, that only happens when I do interviews. I haven't gotten too many emails attacking me, but on the
it's because they didn't find your email.
probably
Yeah,
they're often not too bright.
right.
But
But
when I do interviews, as you saw on YouTube, similar things happened on Renegade Broadcasting. Then they go after me with a vengeance, and they have a script. You can see that the same things get brought up again and again pursuant to a script, so it has to be scripted either out of Tel Aviv or Moscow or both.
yeah, if you look at the comments of your recent Red Ice interview, it's just the same ad hominem attacks. There's no real substance to what they're saying. They're just like, this man does not know what he's talking about. This man is wrong. But then they never actually say what's wrong. Right?
They don't want there to be a discussion. They want there to be a character assassination.
It's pure character assassination. They did the same thing to me. These trolls would, say that I must be, a NATO shill because I'm not saying Putin's a saint. And it's so absurd. I mean, there's so many positions that they would agree with me on and they would agree with you on that you have, that you talk about, but it doesn't matter as long as that one issue that you're not on board with the Putin worship, that's enough for them to throw you under the bus, completely throw you under the bus, dismiss all your other arguments, right?
Well, that's what vindicates your accusation that it's a cult, that they can't think rationally about things because they've been brainwashed. And they're being goaded and cheerleaded on by people who are providing them with the script that they're supposed to follow. So even those who are sincere are deluded, deliberately deluded. And it's such typical communist behavior. The communists have always promoted the character assassination of their critics.
Right, exactly. And this is exactly why I had to just kind of take a back seat in not only that, other reasons as well, but the whole thing has been totally taken over by this Putin cult. I mean, there's almost not one outlet that I can point to that's prominent in the alternative media that isn't totally just pushing that narrative that Putin's a hero, he's a saint. Alex Jones is saying that now. It's funny because you go back to his 1999, that famous broadcast he had. He called Putin a demon, but now he's saying all his headlines are Putin is fighting the New World Order. Putin is destroying the New World Order, right?
Are you recording this as we speak, or?
Yeah, I just clicked the record so I'll just edit it or whatever later.
Great. So let's pick up on that idea of how the tactics and the message evolves,
Right.
because this has to take place in stages for the communists to be successful in what they do. And that staging goes back prominently to the Reagan administration, where the Republicans had to oppose Russia in order to bring about the faked fall of the Soviet Union. And that fake fall was brought about by the Trotskyite neocons who infested the Reagan administration and then the Bush administration. So people might be confused about this flip-flopping, but the flip-flopping allowed the Russians to fake the fall of the Soviet Union and is now allowing them to bring it back and bring it back in a greatly expanded form.
Yeah, and my sense is that during the Cold War, both sides used the threat of the other in order to just boost their own power and crack down on dissidents. So you notice almost the exact same thing is happening today with this new Cold War. You see that the media organs, the mainstream media organs of both the West and East, are kind of giving a platform to so-called dissidents, right? So all these like Western critics of foreign policy, of U.S. foreign policy, they're all over RT, right? These people are on RT every day, and they're just critiquing the West, critiquing Western foreign policy, supporting Russia. But then it's the same dynamic the other way, and some of the Soviet critics would come over to America and kind of just start shilling for America, right? And I see the same thing happening today. All these critics of the West have just jumped totally on board with Russia and Russian foreign policy, and some of it I would say is probably opportunism. Like you have these alternative media pundits that know that RT is a big platform, and that if they suck up to the Russians, that they can get on there, get a show on there like Abby Martin and so forth. So
and make good money doing so.
And become essentially tools of Russia, right? Because
absolutely.
All they're doing, they have zero criticism of Russia on RT, zero, right?
Well, it's a state-run propaganda organ.
And they say all the Western media, these people are such hypocrites. They say all the Western media is propaganda for the state, but then they're venerating and supporting RT, which was created by Putin deliberately as a tool to brainwash Westerners to support him. That was the whole point. It was almost like exactly what the communists did during the Cold War, was to create these foreign media to blast propaganda to the West, and the U.S. did the same into the Soviet Union. So
that was especially true when the New York Times was covering up for Stalin while the Holodomor was going on. And I think there was a guy named Durante who won a Pulitzer Prize or something, and he was deliberately covering up the Holodomor.
There's always been a love affair for Russia amongst the leftists, communists, and now it's amazing that it's now the rightists. It's also some leftists, but it's now the rightists that have this love on with Putin and Russia for their own reasons, and they're kind of forming the same sort of framework, that you had the Communist International that would work with Western communists, give them directives and so forth. But now it's almost like they're doing that with the right-wingers now, where the right-wingers are all sucking up to Putin and Russia because they want to get money, or they think Putin's going to throw them a few shekels, or they're just enamored with Putin because he pays lip service to Christianity or conservatism and so forth. So now all the right-wingers are like trying to make Russia like the hub of their movement now, and they're saying Russia should be like the ideological home base of nationalism. Right.
My take on what's going on, that's why I brought up the Reagan administration, is that these neocon Trotskyite Jews infiltrated it and were utilizing the West to forward Russian interests. When Israel and the neocons pulled off the 9/11 attacks, what they did was invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter to get NATO to attack Afghanistan. So they were actually using NATO instead of attacking Russia or defending the West from Russia. They used it to attack one of Russia's enemies and also one of Israel's enemies, Afghanistan. So the only time that NATO's military power has ever been put to force was against Russia's enemies. And Russia had spent 10 years in Afghanistan trying to destroy that nation. And the very first time that NATO is used, it's used to fight Russia's enemies. And the people who brought that about were Trotskyites. I don't think that's coincidental. And it reveals the infiltration of these Jewish communists into the Republican Party. That it had always been assumed that only the Democrats were infiltrated by the communists. But clearly the Republicans are not only infiltrated by the communists, but they have been successful in getting America to fight wars which benefit Russia and Israel. And the other aspect of that is how this anti-Zionist movement came about and how it has been flipped from being anti-Israel to being anti-Muslim. Now, when it was anti-Israel, what that accomplished for the communists was that it was driving Israel into the Russian camp and against the West, because the West was turning against Israel. And it was also enabling the Muslim invasion of Europe by creating a sympathetic feeling for the Muslims who were being destroyed by these neocon wars, that they ought to have sanctuary somewhere and would provide a useful alliance against Israel. And it was all a deception. It was all setting Europe up for the eventual invasion of communism into Western Europe, when the homogeneity of these societies was destroyed. And when they became heterogeneous, they could then instigate conflicts between the Muslims and the Christians. And then Putin has a pretext to jump in and defend multiculturalism in the West.
Yeah, Putin actually supported the invasion of Afghanistan, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. If you look at the interview he gave with Barbara Walters in 2001, he was the first guy to call Bush on the phone after the attacks and pledge support to the war on terror. And he even hinted like a year earlier that Afghanistan should be invaded, and he was trying to link it to his conflict with the Chechens. Right? He was trying to say that
another Chechen connection.
He was trying to say that the Chechens were getting support from Osama bin Laden, and he actually tried to blame Osama bin Laden and link him to the Chechen nationalist movement because he was trying to discredit them. And like you said in that interview, he did so by propping up some of these more Islamist types in Chechnya, as opposed to the more secular nationalists. Like the first and second presidents of Chechnya were Dudayev, and then it was Maskhadov. Both were secular nationalists. They'd even been in the Russian army at one point. And Putin wanted to discredit them because they were separatists and they wanted to break off from Russia, and he definitely didn't want them to become pro-West. So he had to. They came up with that scheme. Putin, Yeltsin, and Berezovsky came up with the scheme to pay off these Islamists in Chechnya to do that invasion of Dagestan as sort of the first step, and then they quickly booted them out of Dagestan. They could have killed them, the leaders of that. The one guy's name was Basayev, and he had actually fought with the Russians against Georgia in 1992 when Georgia had a war. It was the Abkhaz War, and the Soviets were supporting the separatists there because they wanted to destabilize Georgia, which was trying to break away from Russia. So they sent in some of these Chechens to fight against the Georgians, and one of them was that Basayev guy who became the lead Chechen rebel / terrorist, right? And he was covertly paid off by the Russians to do that invasion of Dagestan. They let him back into Chechnya. They could have taken him out, but the Russian military called off any attack on him, let him back, and then they needed various other provocations to get public opinion behind the war, the full-scale invasion of Chechnya to take out the Maskhadov regime. And then there was the apartment bombings, which you talked about on the Red Eye show, which were clearly instigated, staged, set up to provide Putin the pretext for the war, which made him popular, which gave him the mandate to
and destroy. It was clear the police caught the FSB planting additional bombs. And then days later, they manufactured the falsehood that they were simply running drills, training drills,
which
which
is
was
absurd. Yeah.
absolutely absurd.
And every single
And none
witness
of that is discussed in all these many discussions of Putin. None of this gets discussed. But I'm sorry, you were doing very well. That was a wonderful breakdown of what had happened.
Right, and every witness to that attempted bombing, the one that they foiled, the local police, because the local police, if it was a training exercise, they would have told the local police, they would have told the residents of the building to have an exercise. They didn't tell anybody because it clearly was not an exercise. It was a real attempted
false
attack.
flag terrorism. And if the alternative media is so opposed to false flag terrorism, why do they not object to Putin's false flag terrorism?
That's one of the points I was critiquing these people who are very obsessed with false flag terrorists. They say everything is a false flag in the West. Only in the West. Whenever the terror is against Russia, they say it's all real. And that gives away their total bias, right? So if it happens against a Western state, they instantly say it's a false flag, that the Western governments are behind it, and discredit these governments. But then there's ISIS attacks against Russia, like the jet that was blown out of the sky in Egypt, right? Just as Putin was going to go into Syria, a Russian airliner was supposedly attacked by ISIS, which kind of gave Putin the mandate to really dive into the Syria conflict. And none of them were even investigating that, saying, let's critique this. Maybe it was a false flag, right? It's only when it's in the West. When it's in Russia, they say the terror's all real, right?
And another thing they deny is the Israeli-Russian alliance. When they try, and David Duke was doing it last night on Rents Radio, they point out the fact that Israel and ISIS have a very cozy relationship, but they automatically assume that that means that it's America behind ISIS. Why can it not just as easily and more likely be Russia that is behind ISIS, and Israel is allied with Russia and is supporting ISIS because they are working together to destabilize the Middle East and turn it into a communist bloc so that they can put the Muslims behind an iron curtain?
Well, the thing is, their argument or their counter argument to that would be like, Putin's bombing ISIS, but you can use the exact same argument to say the West is also bombing ISIS, so they can't be behind them either, right?
Well, what they want to do is balkanize Syria, and they're setting up a divide and grinding Syria into dust. Putin is very actively destroying Syria. And another one of the pretexts that he generated deliberately was just before the Sochi Olympics. He said that we have to chase out the terrorists so there will be no terrorist events that will ruin the Olympics. And guess where he sent them? He sent them to Syria. Now, the FSB organized and paid for the transport of these terrorists into Syria that he now claims he is fighting and utilized as a pretext to form a military occupation of Syria where he is destroying major cities.
Right. Well, there was a report in Novaya Gazeta, the famous Russian newspaper that has been just notoriously attacked and stifled, and I think over a dozen of their journalists have been assassinated over the past 15 years. And they ran a report saying the FSB was actually helping these Russian Muslims to go to Syria, claiming that this was some kind of operation to get rid of troublesome Muslims from Russia and just have them in Syria, and then they could attack them there. Either way,
that was the pretext. Putin, after the Olympics, stated that his reasons for going to Syria was so that he could kill the terrorists there and prevent them from coming back. Right. But he's the one who sent them away. Now, if they had the means to send them away, why didn't they have the means to destroy them where they were at initially? Right. Why would they go to all this expense and create all of these international problems and set up bad situation for their ally Syria? How can they claim to be an ally of Syria when they admit that they're deliberately sending terrorists into Syria? And how can they blame the U.S. for the existence of these terrorists in Syria when they themselves transported them into Syria?
Well, Putin himself said that there's 7,000 Russian Muslims fighting for ISIS or various groups in Syria. Now, he had to have at least partially allowed some of them to go there, right? So
Thousands. I think it's been reported that he sent in thousands in 2014. And 2014 is also the year that I became very Putin aware because of the invasion of the Ukraine and the way the media and the Obama administration allowed him to get away with that and did absolutely nothing to defend Ukraine, in spite of the fact that Ukraine had a treaty with the United States that if they were to give up their nuclear weapons, the West would defend them in the event of an attack. And the West reneged on that treaty.
these people in the alt media, they're hypercritical and they're engaged in obsessive scrutiny of all Western countries, right? And especially the United States on foreign policy. But then they're totally ignorant, or they just don't do any research, or they never look into it, of Russia or China. They leave them. They let them do it. They let them do what they do.
And North Korea, can you believe it? The most oppressive regime on the earth, they claim, is fighting the New World Order when it's the ultimate manifestation of the New World Order.
Basically, their position is, it's so predictable what their position is. It's just the opposite of whatever they think is the U.S. government's position or the official media's position. They're just reactive, right? They just take whatever is the polar opposite position of the media. And that was what I was sensing from Henrik in your interview, is that he was saying, like, and this is what a lot of the Putin apologists say, is like, well, you're aligning with the mainstream media and what you're saying. But it's like, no, we're actually
aligning with the truth.
The mainstream media never brings up Putin's connections to Israel. They never bring up Putin's Zionist links. Their critique of Putin, the mainstream media, is just very generic, right? It doesn't go into anything that we're talking about. So it's like...
It never mentions Chabad Lubavitch either, unless it's in the Jewish media.
If Hillary Clinton says the sky is blue, that doesn't make it green. It's like... that their sole argument is that if it's in the mainstream media, it must be totally false. And this is this false dichotomy where they're saying the mainstream is all fake news, there's no truth in anything they're saying, but it's the alternative media that's all real news. You can trust Alex Jones, you can trust the whole alt media, because we have...
But then they will, and Alex Jones does this all the time, is he will hold up mainstream news articles when it justifies his position.
Exactly.
All of a sudden, then it's the glorious truth.
Yeah, he says even the main, it's in the mainstream press, ladies and gentlemen. Even they are saying it, right?
And it's all hand waving. What it allows them to do is dismiss the facts. They don't want to discuss the facts or a logical analysis of those facts. They want to deal in emotion, and your wonderful insight is that they are brainwashed members of a cult, so they want to cheer their leader. And one of the ways that they cheer their leader instead of thinking independently is to dismiss everything the media says and claim that everything is fake. And Yuri Bezmenov said that that was part of the KGB's playbook to destabilize and demoralize the West.
Well, if you look at...
And Trump is playing into it. Trump is doing it. The president of the United States is doing it.
Yeah, he's basically the one that popularized the whole fake news, the media is fake and all that, right? So they are members of a cult, and they're totally brainwashed, and I know people personally that I would hear what they're saying about Putin in Russia, and it was just all this like fawning propaganda. It's so great over there, everything is improving. It's so clear to me that they're just getting one information source, Russia Today, and they're just parroting whatever they hear on there. And I even asked people, I was like, yeah, it's very obvious that you're getting all your information about Russia from RT. Is that your main source? And they'll admit, yeah, that is their main source. See, that's the problem. The problem is when you don't diversify your sources, you're living in a bubble, and you're blocking out any contradictory information that would counter what you're getting. And if RT, you look at their content, it's all based on demoralizing the West. The West is crumbling. The West is in a crisis and so forth. This is almost. That's why it was so intriguing to hear what you were saying about the KGB attempting similar tactics during the Cold War, where they would try to portray the West as a failed entity, and that we should just, fight within our own societies and look to Russia as like the moral state, the moral society. And that's exactly what they're doing today, just under the guise of conservatism or Christianity now, promoting Russia as the new, Rome, the new center of Christianity in the world. What's your take on that?
Oh, I have quite a bit to say about that. What they have done is with the Republican Party, all you're describing about RT had a predecessor in the way that the Christian Zionists worshipped what Fox News told them and what the Rush Limbaugh types told them. And the creation of the KGB infiltration of the Russian Orthodox Church took place under Stalin. And this whole idea that the West is decadent was a Stalinist campaign against fascism in Germany. And they used Ernst Röhm, who was a homosexual, as an example of the decadence of fascists. And they tried to portray it as if it were a homosexual movement. So Putin's gay bashing and his claiming falsely to be a devout Christian and to make Russia Christian is Stalinism. He is forwarding Stalinism. All of this took place back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And it is an expression of his communism, not an expression of his anti-communism.
Right. I saw there was this good YouTube channel. It's called News from Ukraine, and it calls out whenever the Russian media engages in some kind of fakery, right? These alt media people say, oh, the Western media is all fake news, but they never look at the false and fabricated reports out of the Russian media. There's a website called RussiaLies.com, and it documents 240 clear examples of RT and other Russian media faking news stories and literally just making stuff up. And one of them, they took a report about this American family, and there was cameras in this house. I don't know what it was about, but they blocked the English audio, and they put their own audio, and then they photoshopped in the room of a child, an American child, a homosexual pornographic poster on the wall, and it was fake. It was not in the original video. So they're trying to portray America and the West as deeply corrupted and decadent, as you say, by literally faking reports like that. So we're seeing a rerun of this.
Of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, they would show children propaganda films that said, if you're ever in the West, be careful that you don't pick up pens or pencils on the street because they are explosive devices, and the government booby traps them to kill people randomly so that people have a constant fear of terrorism. And they had all kinds of things like that. The great Soviet encyclopedia would lay claim to all Western inventions. And in East Germany, when the wall came down and I came to know some East Germans, they all believed that Henry Ford was a German. Right. They completely rewrote history and made everyone who was famous or great a Russian, a communist, or both. Exactly. And they laid claim to all the inventions of the West and claimed that the West was decadent and falling apart. And they would lie in their 5-year plans and claim that every year milk production had tripled. And they would lie to their people completely and constantly, which is why they have to have a lock on the media. Because if they didn't have that lock on the media, then they wouldn't be able to lie to the people that way. And that's what they're setting up again, is they want to get their people behind an iron curtain, which is why Putin has pushed for legislation making it illegal to deny the Holocaust, and now even to quote the Old Testament in a way which opposes Jewish power. He has made that illegal.
Yeah, yeah. And where are these free speech warriors in the alt media / alt right complaining about some of this absolutely tyrannical legislation in Russia that punishes the most inane speech? There was a report in AP says dozens in Russia in prison for social media likes, reposts. Said a guy in Russia, he retweeted or he reposted a meme that said squeeze Russia out of yourself. It was like a joke. And he was put in jail for 2 years. Dozens of these bloggers have been thrown in jail for retweeting a picture of Putin that has makeup on him. It's a joke. And they're getting thrown in jail. A Ukrainian library was shut down because they claimed it was publishing Russophobic Ukrainian nationalist literature. I mean, this is unbelievable tyranny, and these same people in the West...
And he's tyrannical. He's tyrannical against Russian nationalists. The Russian nationalists were the ones he first attacked.
Yeah,
and he views Russia as a Eurasian communist empire, not as a Russian ethno-state. So why are all these white nationalists promoting him as if he is trying to make Russia a white ethno-state when he's doing the exact opposite?
Right, and the main complaint of those Slavic nationalists is that because he conquered those Caucasus regions, now there's hundreds of thousands of Muslims that are coming into Moscow, and they can do so very easily because they're citizens of Russia. It's not even immigration because they are part of the empire, and it's a multicultural empire. So if you're a white nationalist, it makes no sense why you're defending a Russian multi-ethnic empire. And those Slavic nationalists, Putin doesn't like them because they're calling for a restriction of Russia's borders just to the Slavic ethnic group, which would severely restrict the borders of Russia and cut it off from some of its precious resources. And Putin cares far more about money and resources than ethnicity or preserving traditions and things like that. And then they claim, that the West is decadent and so forth, and Western politicians are all degenerate. Now, there's some truth to these claims. Obviously, we are also opposed to this degeneracy being promoted in the media and so forth. Homosexuality, transgenderism, these things are on the rise, but they're exaggerating it to say we're basically crumbling states and that we're all like that. But the thing is, you look at Putin, there was a very strange video came out where Putin in public went up to a very small child, lifted up his shirt, and kissed him on the stomach. And it was pedophilic. I mean, this was not his kid. I don't know anyone who's gone out and kissed the bare stomach of some child that's not their own. So that is a pedophilic gesture. And after that, he was asked about it, and he made these bizarre, creepy statements. He's like, "Oh, the boy was vulnerable, and he looked like a kitten," and this weird pedophilic stuff. and I put that up on my YouTube, and all these trolls came on and started attacking me. They didn't condemn Putin for the action. They condemned me for putting it up. But then I put a video of Joe Biden doing these creepy things where he was in a photo shoot and he was like touching the children in awkward positions, and he was doing this very pedophilic stuff himself. And all the comments were, Joe Biden is a pedophile, Joe Biden is evil. But on the Putin thing, it was the opposite. They were condemning me and defending and making excuses for Putin. It's unbelievable.
It is. It's typical communist behavior. It doesn't surprise me at all. Yeah. And what they want to do is the Putin cult, which I think you ought to trademark. I think that is really brilliant. I love that. Yeah. The Putin cult is a suicidal cult in the West. Yeah. They believe that they are evil and that Putin is good because he's going to kill them.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, it's classic Jim Jones, and Jim Jones was a communist.
Right.
And he was supported by members of the alternative media, and there were a lot of weird connections with Jim Jones. And the idea is that the world is so corrupt and so evil that we do good by destroying ourselves. And never have human beings thought that way. That is a completely artificial manipulation of people's minds to turn them against their own will to survive. And it has to be coming out of Moscow and Tel Aviv because they are the only beneficiaries of it. Yeah, when did Western man ever say, let's defend Western civilization by annihilating it? Yeah, it's completely absurd.
Yeah, I don't understand what the objective is of these Western alt-right people and white nationalist types who venerate Putin. It's like, what is their goal? Are they just rooting for Putin to like invade us and take us over? I think that's honestly what they want, because they think Putin is like a conservative, right? So they would actually prefer to be ruled by Putin than the various so-called liberal elites that we have. So they would actually prefer and probably would welcome. It's almost like the same scenario in World War II, where you had various leftist and communist leaning people in the Eastern Europe that welcomed the Soviet invasion and were fifth columnists. It's the same thing with a lot of these rightists. They falsely think Putin is one of them, even though Putin's just an opportunist who plays all the different cards to win support. He'll play the leftist card. He'll play up to the inclinations of leftists, rightists, Christians, Muslims, Jews, whoever he can to win support. He's a chameleon. He has no real ideology or views like that. He just is interested in power and maintaining his power. So these rightists have been duped into thinking that he's part of their group, and there's a champion of nationalism. But as you said in that interview, he supports...
I think there are many who have been duped, but I think they're duped by a script that was provided to their leadership. And you can see that it's almost as if memos are going out, because immediately when some news event happens, all the same voices say all the same things.
Yeah. It could be...
And it is not logical, so it's not that they're saying what is obvious. What they're saying is obviously absurd, so it has to be scripted.
Some of them have very real connections to Russia. There was an article in the Business Insider that detailed some of the conferences that Russia held that brought over people like Jared Taylor and Matt Heimbach, who runs what he calls a fascist organization called the Workers Party. It's in the South U.S., and he's openly connected with this guy named Raphael Johnson, Dr. Raphael Johnson, who is a total Russophile, who runs like a blog and a radio show venerating Russia 24/7. All he does is promote Russia and Putin as the savior of the West and all this garbage. So there's very real connections. Like Richard Spencer's wife is a vehement Russian nationalist slash basically imperialist, Eurasianist, who translates the work of Dugin on the internet, and she's hooked in with RT.
How can any Western man support Dugin, who openly states that all of Western civilization should be vassal states of the Soviet Empire?
Yeah, because he tricks them by paying lip service to some of these traditionalist concepts. So
that's true.
They ignore all those crazy statements that he's made, calling for Eastern Europe to be annexed, calling for Ukrainians to be massacred, saying
promoting blacks over whites.
Yeah, he's done that. He said that he justified cannibalism. The guy's
absolutely
a nut. He's a complete nut, and he's an imperialist who wants to create a Eurasian empire, which is in line essentially with the ideas of Kudinhu of Kalergi, who also called for a mixed group of Eurasian type mixed Europeans.
And he was funded by Rothschild and Warburg, and he was a Freemason. And these things are also in line with the first prime minister, who was a communist of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, who stated in 1962 that the Soviet Union would become a Eurasian empire that would take over both continents, and that was beneficial. And he also stated that all of these separate armies would be destroyed in favor of one global army, and implied that global army would be the communists of the Eurasian Soviet Empire.
Right, and then he predicted that the United Nations would be centered in Jerusalem, and that this was an ode to Isaiah the prophet, who called for who prophesied Jewish domination.
In book 2, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4. Isaiah says that Jerusalem will become the capital of a new world empire, and the laws will, for all of the world, will issue forth out of Jerusalem.
Well, Dugan gets promoted by all these alt-right people. Dugan is pro-Judaism. You can even find articles he's written where he's exalting Judaism and the Kabbalah, and he has connections to various Jews in Israel. He's not anti-Israel. He's even praised Israel in numerous interviews. So there's something going on there, and all of these alt-right websites are promoting Dugan. The chief website, altright.com, had a big advertisement for Dugan's new project that he's running. Alex Jones has been on Dugan's show numerous times, and Dugan has been on Alex Jones, and they're cross-promoting each other now. And they're all backing up this Putin worship. Jones is on board, Stefan Molyneux's on board, the alt-right and the alt-light are promoting Putin as the savior. So it's just a terrible situation we have here. I mean, I just cannot see anything good coming of that.
Well, let's break away and discuss some of the myths that they put forward, which claim that Russia is superior to the West. Obviously, they can't claim that Russians have greater free speech, but they claim that Putin was the great man who chased out the Jewish oligarchs that Boris Yeltsin had allowed to take over Russia.
Right. That's easily proven to be just. They're not including all the information, the stuff that happened after that. They're just stopping the clock when he had that feud with 8 or 9 oligarchs, and just ignore the rest of the history that developed. Right.
What he did, there were 3 primary oligarchs that he got rid of: Khodorkovsky, Guzinski, and Berezovsky. Now, Berezovsky helped him engineer his rise to power, and Abramovich and Berezovsky were the 2 Jews that put him in power.
Absolutely.
But Berezovsky was a more secular Jew and used his media empire to partially start to criticize Putin when Putin made too big of a power grab on Chechnya. They had initially set up this terrorist invasion that they could counter and then take over and overthrow the government and put in a pro-Putin government. But Putin went too far, and he came into conflict with Berezovsky. So he got rid of Berezovsky for that reason, not because he was a Jewish oligarch. Khodorkovsky publicly accused Putin of corruption and admitted his own corruption, and that's why he got rid of Khodorkovsky.
Right.
Guzinski had a big media empire that was going against Putin, and Guzinski was aligned with Jews who were not members of Chabad Lubavitch. So Putin got rid of Guzinski so that he could consolidate all of the power behind Abramovich and the Chabad Lubavitch cabal. And he then installed Beryl Lazar as chief rabbi of Russia. And the Jewish press hailed all of this. And it's the Jewish press that let us know that Putin was not an anti-Semite for getting rid of the Jewish oligarchs, supposedly, that he was simply consolidating the Jewish oligarchs' power behind Chabad Lubavitch. And then the Jewish press revealed that Putin had had lifelong connections to many Jews, and in the apartment building that he lived in, he had been befriended by a Hasidic Jewish family, and Putin conveyed that story to Beryl Lazar, and Beryl Lazar publicly announced the story that Putin had told him. And all of these Jews that he had befriended in his childhood and who took him under their wing are now billionaires, and they are billionaire Jewish oligarchs who are thrown government contracts, and they are raping the Russian people to an even greater extent than what was taking place under Yeltsin.
Yeah, so that is their main claim to support Putin, is that he supposedly squared away these oligarchs. So like you said, he took out a handful of them for personal political reasons, only because they were allowing criticism of him on their media outlets, so he seized those, only because Khodorkovsky accused him of corruption publicly. So then he went after him. All of these oligarchs he went after, he had some issue with personally or politically. Had nothing to do with the fact that they were Jews. So these anti-Zionists who support Putin falsely claim that he went after the Jews, right? That he squared away the Jews as Jews specifically, that was his motive. I liken this feud that he had with some of these oligarchs with Stalin's feud with Trotsky and a few other Jewish Bolsheviks that he himself brought into his administration and worked with for years, and then he just had a falling out with them and had them executed. That does not make him a hero. He just replaced them with other Jews, just as Putin is doing.
Look at what happened when that happened. That happened when Israel was being formed as a state. Now, Putin wanted, I confuse Putin with Stalin, it's easy to do.
Right.
Stalin wanted to create anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union so that he could justify expelling the Jews to populate Israel, to steal the land of the Palestinians, occupy it, and populate it. It was all a ruse.
When he
Stalin's wife, absolutely, Stalin's wife was Rosa Kaganovich, the sister of Lazar Kaganovich, who perpetrated, together with Yagodin, the Ukrainian Holocaust, the Holodomor.
Exactly, and on Putin's alleged, quarrel with some of these oligarchs, they ignore the fact that today oligarchy in Russia has tripled, at least tripled. There are 100 billionaires in Russia now, and they control, according to various reports, 35% of all the wealth in Russia belongs to these 110 billionaires. And there is a report in Ynet News, a Jewish...
And they're Jews and KGB agents.
Yeah, this report in Ynet News says 25% of wealthiest Russians are Jewish, and there was a website report on a Russian banking website said 48 Jews are on a list of 200 people who control 132.9 billion and own Russia, essentially totally own Russia. They're totally in bed with the Putin regime. He gives them their contracts, like the Rotenberg brothers that you mentioned, his personal best friends who became mega rich under him. There's, for example, Alex Tenzer. That's
where he got into judo. I think the coach was Arkady or something like that.
Arkady,
and those two brothers he used to visit their judo studio. And there was another woman that he visited in Israel when he went down there.
A teacher,
Yeah, his teacher.
His Jewish teacher, yeah. So
his Russian teacher, I think it was, the Russian language or something like that.
So there's this guy named Alex Tenzer. He's one of these billionaires. You have a guy named Vekselberg, Victor Vekselberg. He's one of the richest billionaires. Mikhail Friedemann, right? There's just an endless list of these. This article says that there's 6 Kavkazi Jews who are on this list. They have a combined net worth of 10.6 billion and an average individual net worth of 1.8 billion. So according to these statistics, Kavkazi Jews, they represent 0.00035% of the population, but they're the wealthiest ethnic group in Russia today. This is 2014 when this report came out. So how can these people claim that Putin is some populist hero for the people who ended oligarchy and corruption in Russia? He simply just he provided this fake illusion of a crackdown on 3 or 4 guys who personally offended him by criticizing him or doing something, and then he just enriched and empowered other Zionist Jews who were more willing to work and collaborate with him. The person who
and Chabad Lubavitch, I would not underestimate the significance of that.
Of course, and then RT itself was created by a Jewish Russian. I forget what his name was, but he ended up being killed, or he died mysteriously. He had a falling out with Putin at some point, and then he went to the U.S. and was supposedly going to give testimony to the FBI about Russian corruption, and he ended up dead. in his hotel room shortly after that. So that is a total myth. They have no argument when you bring up these facts about Putin's empowering of other oligarchs. They just have no response, and it's almost like it's the same dynamic of these people. Some of them even praise Stalin just because he like took.
And they deny the Holodomor now.
Yeah.
You see a lot of the people who have become talking heads in the alternative media supporting the alt-right, starting to claim that the Holodomor was a hoax and that Russians in general survived. And I think you were the one who pointed out that that only vindicates and validates the Holodomor, that the Russians, the Soviets, I should say, were generally destroying people. And they had done the same thing under Lenin, and it was the American government that bailed out the young Soviet government under Lenin when he created deliberate famine. And then it got so bad that the Soviet Union was going to fall apart. So the U.S. government intervened and rescued the Soviet Union.
Exactly, yeah. That was Richard Spencer who on Twitter said that he was complaining. It was actually Henrik Palmgren that linked to a new movie that was portraying the Holodomor, and Spencer responded to that tweet and said it wasn't intentional, others were affected, Stalin's not so bad. And there is this like quasi-Stalinism that's kind of rising, it indicates and it signifies the Russian infiltration of the alt-right and of what nationalism, right? Because why are these people promoting Stalin in Russia all the time? You know, it's clearly
that was another really weird thing. Michael Collins Piper 10, 11 years ago was promoting Stalin. And some of the people that were involved with the Jim Jones escapade in South America, and they were sending American Free Press was trying to get, I think, funds from the Venezuelan government. And exactly. Again, you're probably not familiar with it. It's very esoteric, but there was something weird going on with that whole Jim Jones thing and with the Soviets. And it was like a trial balloon of how to psychologically manipulate people into committing suicide in the name of benefiting humanity.
Like we're seeing today with these people embracing
our enemies as if our saviors. That is really, really weird. And the fact that they react with such vicious anger when I point out the obvious indicates how deeply ingrained this brainwashing has become.
It's so clear that that's what's happening, and
it's so clear, and it's also they played the other side. They welcomed in all the immigrants into Sweden and stuff, and you see these communists openly waving Soviet iconographic banners in support of the Soviet Union and saying, "Bring in more immigrants! Bring in more immigrants!" And decrying white people and decrying Swedes and burning the Swedish flag. Wherever these communists go, they teach people to hate their own heritage and to assist the communists in destroying it. And that's another thing I strongly resent about these supposed fascists who turn against America and either embrace Putin or embrace the idea that we should become Germans and National Socialists instead of remaining Americans and embracing our American heritage. That is obviously a communist subversion, because when you bring up the great Americans who said the same things that Hitler said, they reject those Americans and say that the West is corrupt, and either that all that is completely gone or that it should be rejected outright because the founding fathers were Freemasons, or they come up with some way of attacking and assassinating the character of some of the greatest men in human history.
Yeah, they're clinging to foreign ideologies, right?
They're internationalists and they're communists, and they want you to destroy your own identity so that they can refill your brain with all of their dogma and lies and turn you into a servant of their agenda.
They're acting as fifth columnists and subversives for a foreign nation. I always ask them, I'm like, okay, you love Putin, you think he's perfect, you think Russia's some kind of paradise for Christianity, even though Putin pays lip service to Islam and Judaism as well, all the Abrahamic religions he pays homage to as a political ploy to win votes, but he rigs the elections anyway, so it doesn't matter. But the thing is, if they love Russia and think it's so perfect and so great, why don't they go there? Right?
Because if they go there, they'll be told to shut up or go to jail.
Right.
Or they won't even be given the option to shut up. They'll be thrown in jail immediately.
Right.
Because Putin is creating an opposition which is the antithesis of what he publicly says in Russia, which ought to indicate to rational people that he's setting them up to knock them down.
Yeah, they'd be thrown in jail.
And another weird thing, yes, another really weird thing that is the ultimate tell is that these people artificially make a huge issue out of destroying NATO. All of the KGB defectors who were warning us that the Soviet Union would fake its own dissolution so that it could come back stronger and infiltrate the West said that one of their primary objectives in the false opposition that they're going to create is going to be to get rid of NATO. Yeah. Now, if they get rid of NATO, there's no one to defend the Baltics or Ukraine or Poland when Russia comes marching in, because there is no Article 5 which those nations can invoke, which would protect them under the umbrella of America's nuclear arsenal. Right. And that's what they're setting up. And I suspect this crap that's going on with North Korea is going to escalate, and we're going to hit them with a nuclear bomb, and that's going to be used as a pretext for them to bomb Rome, Berlin, and Paris, which has been one of their objectives for a very long time. You'll see whenever Israel threatens what it's going to do with its nuclear arsenal, the first thing they mention is they're going to bomb Rome, because Rome is their ancient enemy. It was Rome that supposedly chased them out of Palestine and destroyed the Jewish temple, even though it was crypto-Jews in the Roman army who destroyed that temple and did it to fulfill Jewish messianic prophecy. But that's a whole other issue. Yeah. They hate Rome and they want to destroy Rome. And we currently have a KGB agent as Pope, and he is actively destroying the Catholic Church. Yeah. And I think it's very telling that Pope Francis and Patriarch Kirill met in communist Cuba, one of the last vestiges of the Soviet Union in the world.
Well, the former Prime Minister of Italy, Berlusconi, was a bum chum with Putin. They were absolutely they were best friends.
They loved to whoremonger together.
Yeah, and the Russians basically with this anti-NATO agenda. It's so reactionary on the part of these alt media / anti-Zionist.
And so absurd. Why would it be such an issue for them to destroy NATO? It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It's so contrived.
They do it under the pretext that NATO is bombing the Middle East, right? Because it's been hijacked.
NATO is not bombing the Middle East. NATO was only invoked to attack Russia's enemy, Afghanistan, which, as you said, Putin wanted to have happen.
They said that NATO bombed Libya, right? During that attack, there was a coalition.
But that was not an invocation of Article 5. Mm-hmm. But it is not NATO who is destroying the Middle East. It is Putin who is destroying the Middle East and trying to set up a war between Russia's enemies, Saudi Arabia, and Syria and Iran.
Well, like you said, though, NATO has been diverted from its mission by these Zionist neocons, right?
And that is what Trump is setting about doing. The only reason he wants to re-empower NATO is to use it as a tool to destroy the Middle East, which favors Russia.
Well, first he was saying
and as they create this,
right?
Absolutely, but that didn't fly. So the new trial balloon is, let's do what the neocons did when they attacked Afghanistan, and let's redirect NATO. By saying it's obsolete, what he's saying is that we cannot fulfill its mandate to defend Europe from Russian Bolshevism. Well, we have to change its mandate to attacking Russia and Israel's enemies. And by doing that, they're driving the Muslims into the hands of the Russians, because the Russians can then say, we are the great defenders of Islam, as they did throughout the whole Cold War And we saw how horrible that turned out for all Islamic nations.
Yeah.
So what they are doing, this whole anti-Zionist movement has now become an anti-Muslim movement. So just as they use the anti-Zionist movement to push Israel into Russia's lap, they are now making it an anti-Muslim movement to push Muslims into Russia's lap. Now, it was the Russians who put in Angela Merkel to subvert Europe and flood it with Muslims, and it is now flooded with Muslims. So if Putin is the defender of Syria and Iran, he's going to be the defender of the Muslims in Europe, and he is going to promote destabilization and civil war, and he's going to provide them with the arms. And if that goes sour, he's going to hit Paris, Berlin, and chiefly Rome with nuclear bombs, just as we're setting up to hit Pyongyang with nuclear bombs.
What I find so interesting about these anti-Zionists is they're so vehemently opposed to the war on terror when it's being led by the United States and Britain. But as soon as Russia has taken over the war on terror, and Putin himself has said that he's now the chieftain of the war on terror, and there's an article in the Jerusalem Post where Putin says Russia and Israel are absolute allies in the war on terror. And now that Russia's the leader, taken over the leadership of the so-called war on terror, the anti-Zionists and these anti-war libertarians and so forth, they've all embraced Russia and Russian militarism and Russian intervention in the Middle East. If the bombs falling on the Middle East are Russian, they support it. If the bombs are American or British or NATO bombs, they're totally against it. The perfect example of that is George Galloway. He is this notorious anti-Zionist British politician who is opposed to every single Western military action, no matter where it is. But now that Russia has gotten more involved in the Middle East, he's supporting it, totally and 100% supporting it. Yet in 2015, he was campaigning against Britain bombing ISIS, saying that it's going to be bad, it's going to kill more people. But then when Russia invaded and started bombing, he went on the TV and said this was a great thing. So what's
again, as I was pointing out, the anti-Zionists were the ones who helped to welcome all the Muslims into Great Britain. Galloway and Corbyn and David Pidcock.
Right. Well, Galloway,
they were setting us up both ways.
Galloway is a Bolshevik, a multiculturalist who supports hate speech laws, Holocaust denial laws. He campaigned against the British National Party. He admitted that he was an underground agent for the communists and Nelson Mandela in South Africa, and that virtually every white South African that was an activist for against the apartheid was Jewish, and he was praising Karl Marx. He's a communist Bolshevik. And
so is Corbyn. And why was Andrew Anglin endorsing Corbyn when Corbyn is a race-mixing Marxist who called for the rehabilitation of Leon Trotsky in the Russian government? Well, he wanted the Russian government to say that all these mass-murdering Bolsheviks were great guys.
Well, and they're trying to portray in the press that Corbyn's an anti-Semite, and they're having all these...
That's why the communists do that, so that they can destroy the alliance between Israel and the West and drive Israel, not really Israel because the leadership's already there, but the Jewish people into Russia's lap.
My sense is
it's a ploy.
My sense is
You'll look at all the leaders of the anti-Zionist movement throughout its history. They have all been leftists and hardcore Marxists, and they're not doing it. They never do it to chase the Jews out of Israel. What they're trying to do is chase the Jews into Russian hands, communist hands. They want to form a Israeli, Russian, Zionist, communist axis.
My sense is that these communists like Galloway, they're anti-Zionist on the basis that Zionism is racism, but they when it comes to Europe and the West, they side with the Jews internally. So it's like they're against Jewish supremacism only when it's affecting brown people in the Middle East. But as soon as you get over to Europe, he's siding with the Jewish elites and oppressors against whites. So he's just anti-whites, and his main agenda is to promote multiculturalism and so forth, and he only complains about Jews when they're oppressing brown people in the Middle East. Yet he supports all of their agendas in Europe. He supports multiculturalism, open borders, hate speech laws, Holocaust denial laws. He's against any opposition to Jews in the West internally. So it's a very weird game that they're playing. They've co-opted these anti-war people to be stooges of Russia. And Iran is kind of doing the same thing. Now that they've relied more on Russian military backup, they're becoming puppets of Russia. And I used to write for Press TV, the Iranian channel, and they would censor me when I would critique Putin. They'd always not publish it. And you notice on their channels, they do the same thing as RT. They try to portray the West as degenerate, as oppressors, and they promote the migrants as victims of racism in Europe and so forth. So you see Iran and Russia.
But they don't realize that Russia is subverting them deliberately in order to raise oil prices. Russia was supporting them when they were fighting with Iraq. That whole thing benefited Russia by jacking up oil prices. And Russia also, and Iran also supported Venezuela in its struggles under Chavez, the communist, against the United States, in the hopes that it would generate hostility with the U.S. so that Venezuelan oil would be taken off the market and that Russian oil would then become more valuable. So they're playing a game against Iran, and the tell on that is the fact that Iran has tremendous natural gas reserves that are even greater in proportion than its oil reserves to other countries. And Russia has closed them off and isolated them and restricted the size of the pipelines which they allow to leave Iran, so that Iran cannot become a competitor with Russia in the natural gas market. So Russia is playing Iran as the fool by helping them create a war against the West, which will hurt Iran and help Russia. They're setting them up.
Right, and that was the main reason that one of the reasons that he's more inclined to support Assad, because Assad was supposedly blocking some kind of Qatari pipeline that would have cut into Russia's supply and would have,
lowered oil prices.
Yeah. So that was one of the main reasons he stepped in.
And I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but when the Soviet Union was falling, one of the primary causes was the fact that Saudi Arabia deliberately lowered oil prices and caused OPEC to lower oil prices, which hurt the Soviet Union's ability to fund itself because it put such a high percentage of its gross domestic product into military expenditures. They needed high oil prices to prop that up, and Saudi Arabia then became an extreme enemy of Russia. And that is why the Russians set up their agent, Osama bin Laden, to be the scapegoat for 9/11, because they want to create animosity toward Saudi Arabia and again use Saudi Arabia as a scapegoat for what Israel and the Trotskyites did, which was the false flag terrorism of 9/11. Russians hate Saudi Arabians. So that's why you hear all of these same mouths that promote Russia attacking and scapegoating Saudi Arabia and trying to gin up a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which will consume both nations, just as the Iraq-Iran war consumed both nations.
I wanted to ask you about Ukraine, because during the election, there was an incident where Trump changed the Republican Party platform to take out any reference to supporting Ukraine against Russia or arming Ukraine, and this was done in some kind of deal that was set up between Paul Manafort, who was kind of the go-between,
and who was involved with the previous Ukrainian Russian propped up puppet administration.
Yanukovych. He was Yanukovych's campaign manager.
And he was Trump's campaign manager.
And he was exposed in documents that came out that he was working for the Putin regime in years earlier and his specific goal was to lobby and prop up pro-Kremlin politicians in Eastern Europe and the Baltics and that his job was to greatly benefit the Putin government. That was his own memo that he had sent.
Now, is it coincidental that he was involved with Trump in such a prominent way? I don't believe so.
Well, and then on top of that, Trump started praising Putin. It's unbelievable. Like these people in the alt-right and the alt-media want to deny that there's anything to that issue with Trump and Russia, and they say it's all hot air, it's all fake media news, and there's nothing to it. But there was very clear.
But everyone, Tillerson, every one of the people involved, his own lawyers, have some kind of strong Russian connection.
Right.
That's very unnatural and cannot be coincidental.
Tillerson,
And many of them also have connections to Goldman Sachs, and the same people who used to criticize Obama's connections to Goldman Sachs are suddenly silent on that issue.
And Tillerson had got a Medal of Honor from Russia in 2013.
Yes.
His other campaign advisor was Carter Page, who went to Russia, who actually has a business that his second in command was a former Gazprom official. He went to Russia, gave speeches in Russia where he was blasting the U.S., saying Russia's great. And then there's the Manafort connection, very strong connection to these pro-Russian politicians in Eastern Europe. He was directly working for the Putin government as a lobbyist at one point. So how are these not real things? And then to have all these connections to Russia, and then Trump going on the media and praising Putin and saying that we shouldn't support Ukraine, trying to dial that back. That's not coincidental. It can't be coincidental. These people their only argument is that the mainstream has grasped onto some of that, therefore it must be dismissed as fake news. That's their only argument that I've seen.
They did a very similar thing in Russia under Gerhard Schroeder when he made Germany dependent on Russian energy, and then when he got out of office, he hooked up with Gazprom and became rich, and then they put in the communist and Russian agent Angela Merkel. In terms of what's going on in the U.S., again, it's just patently obvious. How can they deny it? But the strange thing is that I was screaming about this back in 2014 and loudly screaming about it in 2015, and the media did not cover it until it was post-election. And the FBI did nothing about it until after the election. And just as the same players who in Obama's Senate race and in Obama's presidential campaigns, his opposition always had strong ties to Goldman Sachs and always took a dive so that he could become a senator and then the president. And he was also promoted by Larry King on CNN.
Then there's
now again, we had Hillary Clinton with ties to Goldman Sachs, and she took a dive. And the media helped to put Trump into power and then turned on him immediately after the election. And that was done as part of this communist process of demoralizing and destabilizing American society. And you'll see that Trump flip-flops on everything from day to day, which is also a part of the demoralization process where it makes it impossible for people to form rational opinions. Right. And as you continually point out, all of these alt-right positions sponsoring Russia are irrational.
There was the other connection I forgot to mention was Michael Flynn. He went to Russia. He's on RT all the time. He was at the RT dinner with Putin. He had phone calls, suspicious phone calls with the Russian ambassador just before the election. And
he didn't declare it, which made him susceptible to blackmail.
And all these...
I was flabbergasted when Henrik, who I respect, felt that was normal, that an American military man would go and sit down next to our arch enemy, Vladimir Putin, and have dinner with him and schmooze with him as if that were normal.
Imagine if a Russian military general went to the United States and was chumming it up with CNN and the American president was there with him.
Or make it Fox News to make it more realistic.
That's incredibly odd. That if the situation was reversed, these people would be flipping out, that saying that guy's a traitor to Russia. And when it's the American guy doing it, they're rationalizing it explaining it away with piss poor excuses, and
As if it's statesmanship to embrace our enemies.
And saying that that's not a connection. That's not a connection. That's a huge connection.
It's unprecedented too.
And then on top of that, the ambassador calls where they discussed Russia sanctions and this possible lifting of the sanctions if. And look, the idea about Russia hacking the election, I don't know what that means, but there's clear evidence that Russia was pulling for Trump. They were pumping out pro-Trump stuff during the election through RT. They had Russian
and
trolls.
Through WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks was always controlled by Russia, and it was a Russian Jew who was involved in WikiLeaks in Sweden who was an anti-Zionist, Israel Shamir. He was another anti-Zionist who was setting up Sweden to welcome in a Muslim invasion. And Israel he was Shamir. Heavily involved. Yes, he was heavily involved with WikiLeaks.
Israel Shamir is a rabid Putin worshiper and promoter. Yeah.
And he was also a promoter of Ron Paul, and I got into a spat with him over that. And he was defending Ron Paul. And Ron Paul has also made a huge display of his Putin worship.
Absolutely. Ron Paul's news outlet that he has on, his second in command there is always on RT all the time. Ron Paul's always on RT, and they're promoting all of Russia's foreign policy as if it's like all of it's legitimate. They support Russia.
And they bash America constantly.
Everything.
And this is a congressman doing this, and the news doesn't ever touch it. Well, that's not true. They do occasionally touch it. But that ought to be main news, and the FBI ought to be looking at it.
I don't know if Paul and those people are just opportunistically sucking up to Russia so they can keep themselves in the press and keep themselves relevant, or if there's something else going on. I can't say for sure. Some of it seems to be opportunism, but it's unbelievable the way the alternative media has totally fallen in line with all of Russia's foreign policy objectives when it comes to Crimea, Ukraine, Syria. They're just totally shilling every step of the way for Russia's actions. They're reprinting Russian press releases as fact. For example, the Global Research website, if you look at their articles, they're reprinting literally Russian fake news websites as fact, and just Russian Kremlin press releases as fact. I mean, this is how lazy it is. It's just a joke.
Well, they're also acting as a press agency, disseminating things from Sputnik and RT and various Russian sources.
Yeah.
So that Western readers who would not normally encounter those articles have them thrust in their faces. But with Ron Paul, I think the tell is that this is not new. There was another libertarian named Murray Roth. I don't know how Americans say it. Germans would say Rothbard.
Rothbard, yeah.
Rothbard. And he was promoting the Soviet Union and bashing America relentlessly. And before that, there was Ayn Rand, whom I believe was a member of the Soviet Trust, sent here to infiltrate anti-communist movements and turn them so that their policies would favor Soviet policy. So the whole libertarian gold bug genre was created out of Moscow and out of Jews from Austria, from the von Mises Institute, which had ties to Warburg and Rothschild. And the whole thing was a setup. It's pro-communist and always has been. It's always been bashing America. Ron Paul is not a new phenomenon.
Chris, what I'm going to just...
It's been going on for decades, and I think that they initially pretended to be anti-communist so they could ingratiate themselves and build up a following. I mean, if they openly came out and say, we worship Leon Trotsky, it wouldn't have worked out. So these things, again, take place in stages.
The Ukraine is so interesting to me because most of the alt media, when that was happening, they totally were just parroting from A to Z the Russian narrative.
Absolutely.
That this is that the Ukrainian Yanukovych regime was good. That all of the protesters are paid by the U.S. to do this. That it's all contrived, that there's no legitimate criticism of Yanukovych, it's all fake, and that all the Ukrainians who are against him are just U.S. CIA puppets, that the Ukrainian nationalists are just CIA puppets. This is Russian propaganda, all of that. I mean,
Absolutely.
The Americans were obviously, like in any situation, the American government was,
and they would do it on cue. That's why I suspect that they're not simply brainwashed or naive. I think they're being paid off, and there's an organization to it. It's deliberate. It's not accidental.
Well, they always complain about the so-called Western meddling in Eastern Europe or on the countries on Russia's border. It's amazing the double standards, because their definition of meddling is if a Western country has relations with those countries, it's called meddling. But what about Russia? Propping up and financing and doing all kinds of operations to empower their preferred candidates in those states. That's never condemned. That's never called.
That's what you're describing is classic Leninism. Lenin said that we have to be for gun control when it favors us, and we have to be against gun control when it doesn't favor us.
Exactly.
It's complete communist behavior, and it's exactly what Lenin openly advocated and famously advocated, that they should take whatever position they favored their interests without any regard to principle.
The argument that I hear these people use, they say Ukraine's on Russia's border, so Russia can just do whatever the hell it wants to it, but they never make that argument. They condemn the U.S. for meddling in Cuba and Latin America and say that that's a terrible invasion of sovereignty, but then when it happens in Russia's sphere of influence, they justify it and say that's just geopolitics.
Absolutely. And they condemn Israel rightly when it invaded Lebanon, but they did not condemn Russia when Russia invaded Crimea and Ukraine.
Right. So Israel. So when Israel can just claim it has a sphere of influence and do all these things to meddle and impose regimes that are favorable to them, but when Russia does it, it's good and it's justified, and Putin's a hero.
Are you recording this? Because absolutely. Well, communists are brainwashed, and that kind of talk only works with people who are brainwashed. Because the dear leader says it's true, and you cannot argue with it. It's a religion. It's a cult, as you so aptly put it.
Ukraine, so
And Putin lied? I mean, he said that those little green men were not his forces.
Well, the alt media was towing that line.
I mean, it was so I was watching this, and I'm like,
they said,
how can he get away with this?
They said that this was this 96%. What was the supposed Crimean vote for connecting with Russia?
Yeah, and they had men with machine guns standing by the election poll, pushing away people who were going to vote against it. They completely intimidated the populace and lied about the results.
Well, and the government in Crimea that's in power now was just totally Russian-backed.
And the narrative that you heard in the alternative media that somehow Crimea was always Russian territory was complete BS.
Yeah.
Crimea belonged to the Tatars, and it was Stalin who displaced all these people and moved in Russians for the very purpose that Putin is now fulfilling, so that he could claim that these Russian minorities are being persecuted, and therefore he has the right to come in and destroy these other countries. There were no Russian minorities in these countries and places until Stalin destroyed the indigenous population and put in Russians. And that's what so concerns me about Putin posturing as if the savior of Islam, and then through Merkel flooding Europe with Muslims who he is now going to persecute with his alt-right anti-Muslim crew, and then claim that Muslims are being persecuted, and he has to drop nuclear bombs on Paris, Rome, and Berlin to stop it.
It's so I mean, one point on Crimea is that they claim it's always Russian, but it was actually under Turkish and Mongol control longer than it was under Russian control. It was never always Russian. That's a lie. And
Turkey's behavior when all that took place is another tell of how they're driving a wedge into NATO. All Turkey had to do was close off Russian access to the Mediterranean, and it was in Turkey's interest to strongly oppose Russia, because they have had, I think, 10 or 12 wars between each other, and Crimea was always a pivotal point in those wars. And yet, Turkey acquiesced together with Obama to support Russian interests. And there's a strong communist movement in Turkey, and Erdogan is tied in with Russia. They are allies, they are not enemies, and they're working to destroy NATO. And Greece has also got Putin puppets in there, and they're going to try to artificially manufacture a war between Greece and Turkey to split up NATO.
The Putin cult manufactured by his PR mastermind, his name escapes me right now, but this guy is like this genius PR strategist, and he admitted that his strategy with Putin was to play all the sides, to appeal to all the sides. And if you look at what Putin does, he portrays himself as a savior to all the different groups. So with the Middle East, he says he's going to save, Iran, so he's saving the Arabs and Muslims, he's going to save them. But he killed 50,000 Chechen Muslims during the war. So how could he be a savior of Muslims when he's more than willing to kill them when it suits him? He's more than willing to kill his own people when it suits him. He portrays himself as a savior of Christians and a protector of Christianity by going to a church and bowing his head at a church.
And wearing a cross.
Right. He portrays himself as the savior of Jews when he called for them to come to Russia if they're persecuted in the West.
And wearing a yarmulke.
So he appeals to all the different groups. He portrays himself as the savior to everyone, and that is his specifically designed PR strategy by his little sidekick there.
That's a great insight of yours. And do you recall all that homoerotic propaganda that the alt-right put out of Putin riding on a bear and bare-chested? Right. Really weird, very gay stuff that they constantly promote. Putin riding on Obama's shoulders.
They promote him as a manly man, a strong leader, and just the fact that he's white is enough to make him a favorable figure in the white nationalist movement.
That's another thing I brought up with Henrik was who really are Putin's parents. There's a woman in Georgia, Vera Putina, who challenged Putin to have a genetic test and claimed that she was his mother. And Putin assassinated all the reporters who were going to put this information out in the public in 2000 when he was coming up and facing an election.
Well, he assassinated all the journalists, a lot of them that were investigating the apartment bombings. Anna Politkovskaya.
Yes, some of those people were investigating both things.
Numerous opposition politicians, they actually formed what was called the Kovalev Commission, and this was investigating Putin and the FSB's possible links to the bombings, and the two politicians, opposition, that were associated with that were killed. One was shot, the other one was poisoned. Politkovskaya was shot. Litvinenko, who wrote a book about that, was poisoned. Another guy that was running that, he was thrown in jail. And
poisoned in a vicious, cowardly way with radioactive materials. I think polonium or something like that.
Well, the Putin apologists try to claim that wasn't Putin, and it was like
that it was the British who did it.
Yeah. They just come up with an excuse for everything, right?
That Russians are too macho to poison somebody, even though the KGB has a recorded history of doing that all the way back into the 1950s, poisoning people with radioactive.
The two Russians that were linked to that and that met with Litvinenko the same day he fell ill, both of them were KGB military, and one of them, his name was Lugovoy, he gave an interview to a Spanish newspaper, and he said Russian traitors should be exterminated, and he also had a show in Russia called Traitors. So he was like bragging, he was boasting that he was.
But that's all a coincidence.
Yeah, and he's protected by Putin. They won't extradite. They won't let him be extradited. But they claim it was the CIA trying to set up Putin because, they said the same thing with the Nemtsov killing. Remember when Nemtsov was shot right outside the Kremlin walls?
Yes.
2015. All these alt media hacks were saying that was just a provocation to make Putin look bad. So amazingly, Chris, all of Putin's critics and enemies are being killed by his enemies to make him look bad. So there's no more critics of Putin left.
It's just
that's
absurd. It's absurd on its face.
The Nemtsov murder is so clear. Look, there was five assassins. They were all Chechens, and they were sent by Kadyrov, who the chief assassin. They even admitted to the police. They said, we killed Nemtsov because he's a, quote, Western prostitute and a traitor. And just before the assassination, Ramzan Kadyrov, the Chechen puppet,
head of the Chechens, who loves Putin,
who's a loyalist to Putin, who's a total stooge of Putin, does anything Putin says. He was putting out threats to Nemtsov and other Russian opposition politicians, putting them in crosshairs on the social media and threatening to kill them. And then
he also wanted to go into Syria and help Putin out in Syria so that Chechens would be fighting Chechens in Syria, and he did the same thing in Ukraine.
He sent 300 Chechens to fight with the Russian rebels against Ukraine.
And they got destroyed. They got eaten up.
And this is amazing. You see that the alt media is so comical. So they condemn the Chechens who are separatists as jihadists, but then they support the Chechens who are fighting for Russia against Ukraine and say that they're not jihadists. It doesn't make any sense.
It's bizarre. It could only be as it's contrived by the leadership and the people who sincerely believe it are brainwashed by the communists and demoralized so that facts and logic have no effect on them. And it's exactly what Yuri Bezmenov described. Yeah. You can find his videos on YouTube easily.
So this is another point. Russia is completely against all separatism within Russia. It's illegal. Numerous people in Russia have been thrown in jail simply for saying that they want separatism. They killed anyone in Russia that's a separatist, right? Yet they support Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine and say that they're freedom fighters and that they deserve to be separate from Ukraine. And Putin was supporting them as a legitimate force. He said they have legitimate concerns, yet he kills any separatist and jails them within Russia. How do they justify this amazing double standard and hypocrisy?
I don't think they attempt to. I think they try to avoid it and say that you, for saying that, are anti-white.
Well, they say you're
just
Russophobic.
Wave their hands and scream.
They say you're Russophobic, right? And this is incredible because they side with the rebels, and this is another huge problem they have. So that it's bad.
Well, how do the Chechen people themselves deal with all of this is an open question, which I think ought to be posed to them.
Well, there's a documentary showing any Chechen that criticizes Kadyrov is assassinated, and he sent assassins into Europe to kill Chechen exiles who criticized him. So
that'll work.
Right. So this is the thing. In Ukraine, these alt-right people basically support these Novorussia people that want to carve out a mini state and hand it off to Putin and be absorbed into Russia, right? They call themselves Novorussia.
They want a trigger point for Putin to then launch a war against all of Western Europe.
Well, and they call their republics the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. That's a communist term. And they put pictures of Stalin up in their strongholds. There's
absolutely
an article in The Guardian showing these pictures.
And Soviet flags. And they had Soviet badges on their uniforms.
And they portrayed their entire war with Ukraine as a new, renewed war against fascism. Right?
And it's the fascists who cheered it on. It's asinine that anyone takes this seriously. And they're only able to take this seriously because this whole alt-right media shuts out voices like yours and mine.
The amazing thing is there's a video on YouTube.
Not the whole. God bless Henrik Palmgren.
Right. Well, I mean, he has basically. You were the only one on there that was able to say that, but virtually all the other guests are pro-Putin.
It's kicked off a storm.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Ukraine is, I saw a video about documenting foreign volunteers that joined with the Russian rebels, and all of them were admitted communists. There was Spanish communists that went over there and said that they went over because they were fighting fascism. There's a report in the Israeli Jerusalem Post saying that a dozen or so Israelis joined the Russian rebels because they were opposing fighting neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So how is it that you had, Ukrainian nationalists, the Zvoboda party in the right sector?
Have you ever confronted with Heimbach or Spencer with any of these facts and said, how can you justify your support of Putin,
Yeah,
given this reality?
I sent my article to on Spencer to Spencer. I emailed it to him, and he gave me a one-line response. He just said, "Thanks for writing this," and then he had no response.
Wow.
So that to me, they can't answer these things. If they were ever in a debate, they just be run over, because there's no way they can justify these totally contradictory positions at the same time. Being fascist, calling themselves fascist and Nazis, but then supporting Putin, who outlawed the Holocaust denial and is waging a war against Nazism in Ukraine. I mean,
and why do they call themselves fascists is what I could understand in Spain or Italy, but why would someone who associates with the Nazis call themselves fascists? It's generally communists who call the Nazis fascists because they don't want to admit that the Nazis were National Socialists, and they don't want the term socialist tainted with the stigmata of Nazism.
Well, they just think it's all part of the same general right-wing white nationalism.
Well, in Russia, the basis of it all is the fact that Russians suffered so horribly when Germany attacked the Soviet Union. They lost tens of millions of people, and Putin is playing on that.
What I've read, though, is that Stalin killed most of those, or at least half of the Russians who died in World War II were killed by Stalin.
Oh, absolutely. And Stalin would set up his troops. They didn't want to fight against Germany. And he would set up a line of Chinese behind the Russians. And if they didn't go and fight, they would be shot.
Exactly. And anyone who even stepped inside a German, was captured, if they were sent back to Russia, he would immediately execute them.
Yes, and a big part of my book is a description of how the Soviets and the Jews are still fighting a war of extermination against the Germans. And Putin is very much a part of that, breaking up and driving wedges between Germany and America. Yeah. And infiltrating Germany and sending in all kinds of immigrants into Germany and stifling German free speech. And one of the intended effects of the breakup of the Soviet Union was to instill communists in Western Germany. And that's what they've done with Russian agent Angela Merkel. And they are setting about genociding the German people. And the Russians are fully behind it. Every year, Putin holds an anti-fascist parade, and it's one of the biggest events that he hosts. Oh, yeah, and he is constantly saying how he is going to defend Russians and Jews from fascists, but the only fascists that exist are the ones that he's manufacturing.
Well, there's a politician in in Germany named Gregor Gysi. He's a Jewish leftist, and he's on video saying that Germany needs to welcome in more refugees, that it's a good thing that Germans are not having children, and that this is a great thing because Germans have a terrible Nazi past, and that it's great that they're basically not producing enough children to replicate themselves. So this is
all communists and Jews setting about to genocide Germany, and it's also the same thing is being promoted by the alt-right by saying that Western civilization is bad and that it's good that Russians and communists are going to destroy the white race because it has become so corrupted that its salvation is in its ruin. Gregor
Gysi is also pro-Putin.
What a surprise.
So it's incredible, the level of infiltration. I mean, I've seen these.
It's not incredible to me because the communists have been doing this for 200 years, essentially.
Yeah.
It is their modus operandi. And there are some very good books, two very good books that were put out by Anatoly Golitsyn, New Lies for Old and the Perestroika Deception, which reveal how all this was planned. And all of his predictions as to what would take place has taken place. with amazing accuracy. That also indicates how amazingly strong and powerful they are, that they could fulfill their plans to the letter with no hindrance. That's pretty damn good, and that indicates that they have completely infiltrated all of the mechanisms of power, and that the only reason that these things are delayed is because they have to utilize mechanisms like the alt-right to subvert people into voluntarily going along with their agenda.
Absolutely, and that's why the alternative media, in my view, is just useless at this point. It's too infiltrated. It's too agenda driven.
It's not only useless; it's hostile.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
But the way that you can deprogram cult members is to confront them with the facts. Mm-hmm. So we have to constantly involve ourselves with this alternative media so that we can confront them with the facts. And neuro-linguistic programming and cultism can be defeated with the facts. I think it'll start clicking with people. If we can get this out, get this interview we're doing right now, it'll make a tremendous difference.
I hope so. I mean, I've kind of become cynical about it and disillusioned with the whole thing, seeing so much.
Well, that's what they want you to do. That's what they're hoping for. You can't allow that to happen. Touching again upon the myths of the alternative media, that Putin is a hero and cannot be pro-Jewish, is one of the myths that he is fighting Syrians. He is fighting in Syria, and that Israel, therefore, is opposed to Russia. But Israel has said not a word against Russians occupying Syria. They cheer it on, and they want to utilize it as a method of balkanizing Syria. So this is another one of their myths, that Putin is on our side and is anti-Jewish because he is helping out Assad, and Assad is one of Israel's enemies. Assad is not one of Israel's enemies. Yeah. Assad is one of Israel's excuses for engaging in the balkanization of Syria. But many Israelis have come out and said that we want to keep Assad in power. And what they're doing is utilizing Russia to divide Syria up to the borders of greater Israel, and then they will utilize an American force together with Israel to expand Israel's greater Israel up to that border, and then they will use Russia to shut the Syrians and the Kurds on the other side of that border behind an iron curtain. And I even heard Charles Krauthammer stating that he wanted to use Malta as an example of how to utilize Russia to balkanize Syria.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the thing is, Israel's position on that is that they want to keep them, Assad versus his opponents, just fighting and killing each other. The guy
and grinding Syria to dust.
Yeah, they actually, one of the neocons said that if basically their position was that if one side was getting too weak, they would pump funds covertly into that side, and it didn't matter if it was Assad or the rebels, they would keep them both afloat as long as possible so that they just keep killing each other and dragging.
They did the same thing in Lebanon with the Christians versus the Muslims. They did the same thing when they pitted Iran and Iraq against each other, and they're doing the same thing in Syria. Putin is absolutely on the side of Israel to ruin Syria, and Putin has openly stated that Assad has to be replaced and Syria has to be restructured.
Well, he said that Israel's a special state to Russia in a meeting with Jews. And he said that the reason for that is that a third of Israelis are Russians. And the Russian language is the second most spoken language in Israel. And they have Russian newspapers, and Putin's party has even an office in Israel. And Gazprom has also set up exploratory projects with Israeli gas companies to start looking for gas off the shore of Gaza.
And they have a red Russian Orthodox Church that they utilize frequently as a KGB headquarters in Israel.
When they set up in 2008, I believe, a no-visa agreement between Israelis and Russians, and there are numerous dual citizen, probably hundreds of dual citizen Russian Israelis who vote in Russian elections, and often they vote for Putin. And there are numerous other weapons deals between Russia and Israel, and there is numerous articles have been written by Jews praising Russia as a great ally of Israel. There was one in the AP Associated Press that said, Russia, Israel's ally in Moscow, and so forth. So it's just a total baloney narrative that Russia is an enemy of Israel, that he's an enemy of Jews. They've claimed that he kicked out the Rothschilds, which is false. People can just look up Rothschilds, type in Rothschild firm Russia, Associated Press, and there was a report in 2016 saying that the Rothschild financial house had an office in Moscow, and they were recruiting new people for in 2016. So how did he kick out the Rothschilds? This is a myth.
Well, as you said, even the Mossad was complaining that Putin had set up an office, I think in Tel Aviv, to request that Russians with great skills who had emigrated to Israel return to Russia, and that they were afraid that they were losing some of their best people who had intimate knowledge of their high technology sector, as Brendan O'Connell has pointed out, to go back into Russia. And as you said, he proposed the idea that if Jews are being persecuted in Europe, they should return to the Soviet Union, to Russia, where they will be welcomed and safeguarded.
Yeah,
Now, how can the man who positions himself as the anti-fascist and safeguard of Jewry promote fascists abroad? It's a setup.
Well, they're fascists that work for him, so...
Yeah, and they praise him. That's another hypocrisy, is Adolf Hitler said that the war started so that he could stop the Bolsheviks. And yet, these same people who promote Nazi iconography promote Bolshevik iconography.
But they condemn the Ukrainian nationalists, who Russia calls neo-Nazis, and
the Banderas, yes.
And slam them as controlled opposition.
CIA, as you said, and even as agency of the Mossad.
So what?
And there's some truth in it. Don't get me wrong. The Mossad is promoting it so that they can provide their Russian allies with an excuse to attack.
But I don't understand what their claim of controlled opposition is. If the Ukrainian nationalists are controlled opposition, then
they're controlled by Russia.
How is Putin not that then? It's like Putin has far more Jewish support and connections than these Ukrainian nationalists, who are reviled by Jewish organizations as Nazis and Nazi collaborators who glorify Nazi collaborators, Stepan Bandera. They hate those groups. In fact, the Svoboda Party was listed on the Simon Wiesenthal list as one of the top anti-Semitic parties in Europe. So how is it that these neo-Nazis and fascists are condemning an actual nationalist party that Jews hate as a party that's working for the Jews, but then Putin in Russia, who are literally banning Holocaust denial and working with Israel, is not
and
condemned.
Holding anti-fascist parades annually?
It's just mind-boggling. Their logic it has no sense.
Can we switch gears for a brief moment? One of the things I brought up in my Red Ice interview was the assassination of Oleg Eravinikin. Boy, that's a tongue twister. He is the KGB and FSB general who helped Christopher Steele compile the Russian dossier against Donald Trump. And he was found in the back seat of his car dead. His name is spelled Oleg, last name Erovinkin.
Okay, I haven't heard about that.
The reason I bring that, it's amazing to me that people haven't heard about that. I thought that was very significant because he was assassinated right when that report started to gain traction in the press, which to me indicates that there's a lot in that dossier that is true that Christopher Steele put out. And Christopher Steele was forced to go into hiding for fear of his life. And the reason I bring it up is that people are now saying that Trump is a traitor for attacking Syria, and they are building up this whole narrative that Putin is not behind Trump because Trump is working against Putin in Syria. But that bombing and that chemical attack had Russian fingerprints all over it in providing the pretext for Trump to bomb Syria. And it all happened right when the story of that Russian dossier broke and Vinkin had been assassinated. So I believe that it was done to create a diversion from the story of the Russia dossier and also to make it falsely appear that Trump and Putin were not allies. But the effect that it has is, again, to balkanize Syria between these two forces and provide a pretext for more of the grinding up of Syria.
What I find so interesting is that the alt-right, especially Richard Spencer, they were total bootlickers of Trump during the election campaign, mouthpieces for him, supporting him. Yet they actually turned on him. A lot of these alt-right leadership turned on Trump simply because he did that one isolated bombing against an Assad base. So what this shows me is that they're far more loyal to Russia and Russia's interests than even to Trump, right? Because they only draw the line when Trump does something that affects Russia and Russia's interests. So Assad is Putin's man in Syria. So therefore, Trump's only bad when he does something that is not favorable to Putin, right? So that shows that they're more actually in favor and they're more
devoted to
concerned with Russia's geostrategic interests than even their fealty to Trump. They're willing to throw Trump right under the bus if he does one thing that isn't in line with what Putin wants. So
I observe that as well, and I think it's very important that you point that out. That's absolutely true, and I observed it, that they will turn on Trump on a dime if he conflicts with what they view as being in Putin's best interest.
It's amazing because
they don't give one whit about Syria. They only care about Putin.
Exactly. They don't care really about Assad. It's just that he's Russia's ally in the region, and that's their main concern. And they so their only issue with Trump is that, according to them, he's betrayed Putin, who they were hoping he was going to ally with and be good friends with and have good relations with. So the overarching theme here is that Trump is not, according to them, according to this bombing in Syria, Trump is not actually a puppet of Putin, and that's bad. They don't like that. They wanted him to be that, right?
Yeah.
That's
these good American patriots, right? Yes, and I think there's a bigger thing that's going on behind the scenes. Is what they're trying to set up is this great statesmanship of Trump, the anti-Russian, going to meet with Putin in another Malta to create what Malta created, which is Russian imperialism and American imperialism dividing up and creating an Iron Curtain right down the middle of Syria.
Right. I think
they're going to bring about peace after this horrific war, where they have so weakened the Syrian people that they'll have no means of fighting against it. With another Berlin Wall right down the middle of Syria, and Iran will be supporting that sector of Syria, and Israel will dominate the other part, just as Israel dominates the Golan Heights.
Yeah, I think that's probably what they have in the works. The alt-right and these people, they don't even really care what goes on in the Middle East. So for them,
and think of how that empowers Russia to gain that foothold, and then to present itself as being the defender of Islam. again, a whole big chunk of Asia is taken up by Islamic nations. So for them to fulfill this communist Eurasian dream, they have to take over all of Islam. And then they can make them Bolshevik slaves, and Israel will be able to do whatever it wants, including destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and building a temple to their God, where they can then anoint the Jewish king who will issue forth all of those laws, just as Isaiah prophesied in chapter 2.
It's so terrible, like the different factions that have developed, because you and I, from what I've understood of your interviews, you know, we oppose this mass immigration into the West, this degrading of the West, this
Absolutely.
breaking up of the homogeneity of our nation states, which is this communist globalist plot led by people like George Soros, Peter Sutherland, who have called for this. And we're stuck between like choosing different masters, where we either have to be pro-Muslim and allow them in, or we have to be pro-Russian and become slaves of Russia. And
that's one of the main themes of my book. One of the main themes of my book, and it's being pro-Russian by being anti-NATO. We have to side with politicians who either say, let in all the Muslims, or they say, abandon NATO and kick out the Muslims. Now, the ones who say abandon NATO and kick out the Muslims don't even really want to kick out the Muslims. They want them to become a part of French society, say. They don't really want to expel them. They want to vet out the supposed terrorists, still welcome in more Muslims, but just ensure that those Muslims don't wear a burqa and adopt French culture. So it all ends up in the same thing, and the same thing is the destruction of NATO and the incorporation of international heterogeneous societies that will eventually breed out white people and destroy Western civilization in favor of Russian Bolshevism.
Right, in the form of the Eurasian Empire. And they're manipulating this migrant crisis. Russia actually...
They created it so that they could manipulate it. It was the Russian Bolsheviks and the Trotskyites and the communists who were behind all of this. And as you correctly pointed out, Richard Coudenhove-Kalagi, in his book Praktischer Idealismus of 1925, said that this would take place. He said that the Jews were a superior race and that they had the right to rule over the world. He expressly said that in this book, and that the white race will be bred into a mongrel race that resembles the ancient Egyptians in appearance, and that they will mix with Africans and Middle Easterners and be bred out.
Well, and that's what these Eurasianists want, because a lot of these people probably cling to some of the mixing they went on during, the Mongolian invasions of those regions.
Well, that's what Dugin said. Dugin said that Russia will be spared this because Russians are a mixed race.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing that these people condemn, if there's the Middle East thing, they say, the Western coalition that bombing ISIS, they say, is if a single civilian is killed, it's a terrible crime, right? But then when Russia, there was a report that said Russia, in the first 6 months of its invasion, killed at least 2,000 civilians. They deny that, or they say it's all fake news, or else they justify it and say it's just collateral damage. But then they would condemn it if it was the U.S. that did it.
It just demonstrates that they are not operating off of principles. They are operating off of cultish hero worship.
They're just war propagandists for the Russians.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so obvious, it's ridiculous to even express it any other way. And thank you for saying that. They're paid propagandists for the Russians.
And it's just exasperating having to see this and then look at the ad hominem ridiculous conspiracies that they throw at you. Oh, you must be working for the CIA because you don't like Putin, right? You must be working for the Zionists, even though their hero is doing so himself. It's like the level of just disconnect is shocking to me, and I don't know if we can really win these people over. It seems to me that the tidal wave is against us, and this Putin worship is almost taking over totally the alt media and such. So I don't even know if we can compete, because our voice is as rational as our voices are, as logical as our arguments are. There's so many of these people that are just not actually principled and don't have morals. They're thinking of this as like it's just some chess game, and they just want to back the lesser evil, whatever they think is the lesser evil. So I don't know where to go with it. I mean, this book you've put out, I'm glad you put it out. It's necessary. And I've done similar things. I've written about these things on my website and my blog and so forth. But it's it's extremely unpopular. You've seen yourself how crazy they erupt with a vicious fury when you bring up these things.
Well, that could be used against them because they go too far. And in these comment sections, it's obvious that many of these people are trolls working out of Moscow, and they expose themselves. So we're drawing them out and forcing them to expose themselves. And sane people are going to reject it. They're going to see that this piling on, this ad hominem attack, this avoidance of rational argument is not what Western civilization was built upon. They want to start to see and hear rational, fact-based argumentation, and there's a thirst for it that we can quench. And I think it will become an explosive effect, and they're going to have to start modifying what they do and hiding it better. They have become too bold to the point where they have exposed themselves, and I do see a lot of people turning against them. And I think you underestimate slightly the wave that is happening. And communists are very, very sensitive to the idea of counter-revolution. So they are going to come at us with a vengeance, as you have seen already happen. And they view us as counter-revolutionaries. So it's going to be a vicious fight, but we have to fight it. We have no choice. Okay, the book that I have put out, which addresses all of these issues, is called Putin's Reign of Terror, The Permanent Revolution in Our Time.